Great. So welcome to the our first content class in this course. We were supposed to read the great book by Caroline Humphrey. Marx went away, but Karl stayed behind. It's a huge book, and I think it's one of our, I think the most voluminous book that we are reading this semester. And it came on the first week. And I will just talk a little bit about I sent the questions that we're hopefully going to get through. But I will talk a little bit about the methodology that Caroline Humphrey used and her anthropological method combined with her archival and documentary work that she did, and we'll also talk about the theories and about division of labor and division of labor in. But before I start, I also wanted to ask, have you had an opportunity to watch Hoshbol Kulsara, Farewell Kulsara? Yeah, and in that movie we have also a glimpse into the life of Kazakh kolkhoz in a bit earlier period, immediately after the war, and we already see the kind of tensions and the sort of in the figure of Tanabai. He is a communist, right? He's a herds, he's a жылқышы, like a horseman, right? And but he's sent by the party because horses are no longer the priority for the party, and it's also in Caroline Humphrey's books, because they also have among the so-called молочная товарная ферма, MTFs, like milking brigades, the овцеводческая товарная ферма, ОФМ, ОТ, овцеводческая товарная ОТФ, and коневодческая товарная ферма. They also have коневодческая товарная ферма, the horse brigade, but they're not doing much with horses, so it's kind of they're not using the priority for the Soviet period. And it's also interesting because after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you know, like as you can see, as you've read in the book, and a lot of emphasis was placed on the sheep population, right, in these republics, in Buryat as well as in Kazakhstan. Like, for instance, one of the our goals in the late Soviet Union was to reach like 50 million population for the sheep, like to the number of sheep. And of course, we never reached this, and it was like a huge number for the for even like our country is vast and rich, but still it's a huge number of sheep. And I think at the end of the Soviet period, the number of sheep was like the real number, not the reported numbers, because as Caroline Humphrey also notes in her books, there are oftentimes these discrepancies between the reported numbers of livestock and the real numbers. So the real number in the 1990s was 36 million of sheep and goats. In Russian, это мелкий рогатый скот, and about 9 million of cattle in Russian. It's крупный рогатый скот, and these numbers like plunged dramatically after the fall of the Soviet Union. So we lost like most of the sheep population and most of the cattle population. We are trying to reach like the numbers that were in the late Soviet Union, but we have not reached them yet now, like 30 years after. But the interesting thing that's happening is for the host population. So as I said, the host population, like the Soviets, like did not see much, I guess, product value in horses, right? And of course, after the collectivization, like the horses were taken from the people, and Karl Marx kolkhoz, they have the коневодческая товарная ферма of around 400 something horses, but about 150 of them are used for transport and for riding for herdsmen, but most of the horses are not used, and the horse is wondering what's the value of, like, so they're not kind of adding anything to the like production numbers of these kolkhozes. So back to Kazakhstan. So if the cattle population and the sheep and goats population plunged dramatically, the horse population has grown. Not dramatically, but it has steadily grown from about 1 million something in the end of the 90s, and now we are above 3 million population of horses. And the reason for that, one could call it retraditionalization, because something that horse herding is something that was done in this, in our geography, in our climate conditions, quote unquote, traditionally. But the main reason for this is, of course, the failure of the infrastructure, right? The Soviet infrastructure has been dissolved and came like dilapidated and could no longer be of use to the people. But the horse herding, it did not require any infrastructure apart from the, you know, landscape, because in Russian it's horse herding is there are, like, one could say two, like horse farming and horse herding. And horse herding is in Russian табунное коневодство. It means that the horses are all year round are on the pastures, including in winter, and they eat grass from under the snow. The horse population has grown, as I said, because of this табунное коневодство, horse herding practices that did not require any infrastructure from the state, right? Apart from the, you know, like land as a means of production and the skills of herding, right, by the people. So in the end, like in the moment of crisis, what was really needed are the skills. And we also read in, I think, later chapters, Caroline Humphrey's ideas about what's happening with the traditional herding skills in Buryatia. So that's an interesting moment. And of course, the difference with the movie, as I said, the movie is set in tougher times, right? And this Zhilkasha, like the horseman Tanabai, he's sent to herd sheep, right? So previously he was herding horses, which requires, you know, kind of a masculine thing to do. You have to be a masculine man to tame the horses and so on. And then he was sent to herd sheep, and the requirements, the plans, there was a delivery plan by the party, and the delivery plan, if you remember, was 125 lambs from 100 ewes, yeah? 125 ягнят от 100 овцематок. Yeah, and he did not fulfill the plan because of the circumstances out of his control, like the places for lambing were not set and so on. And of course, lambing is the most difficult period in sheep farming, right? You have to take care of the lambs, unlike the horses actually, because the horses are, I guess, one of the most independent animals in this sense. They don't require human assistance at all, like in terms of reproduction, of their own reproduction. You don't have to help them. You don't have to take care of them newly born offspring. They will do it on their own. So, but with the sheep, you have to like make sure that the lambs survive after the during the lambing period. And he does not fulfill the plan, and he's punished. He's expelled from the party, and he becomes disillusioned. And moreover, what happens to his stallion, right? The what's his name? Kulsary. Yeah, the stallion's name. And I think Raushan wrote, I hope the horse doesn't die. This didn't die, but what happened to the stallion is that it was castrated, right? And it's kind of an evolutionary death for the, not a natural death, but like evolutionary death for the stallion. It's kind of the tragedy, like, of the whole. It's like the stallion was castrated, and it like the Tanabai was castrated as well, in terms of his dreams have been snatched away from him, and his like belief in the future and in the Communist Party and so on was also snatched away from him, because that's, you know, that's the castration of this, you know, primary stallion, something that was not supposed to happen, right? Because this is a stallion that was, you know, just tulpar, this kind of a stallion that has to reproduce, right? That has to leave the offspring and so on. And it didn't happen. So that's the tragedy of the Aitmatov's novel. Also, it has this kind of post-colonial, I guess, passes to it, post-colonial kind of motives to it. But that's not what's happening in Caroline Humphrey's ethnography, because all these periods, I guess, have already passed, and now we are into the more, like, into the calmer periods, under Brezhnev's period, and the plans of the sheep herdsman in Caroline Humphrey is 100 out of 100, which is kind of more humane plan, and they all deliver this plan, right? And they are all, and the extra kind of offspring, because with the sheep lambing, like oftentimes, you know, we say in Kazakh, yegistuat, right? Twin. So there is this kind of growth that they can use at their own discretion, like extra towards in excess of what's required by the plan. So I guess just wanted to point out the differences. And Caroline Humphrey also writes that, you know, she's describing a certain period, she's describing something that she witnessed herself, seen with her own eyes. But of course, the history of the kolkhozes is not, she alludes to it into her initial chapters. She says that, you know, of course, kolkhozniks, or you know, in the Soviet Union, there were like 3 categories of, one could say, classes or estates, right? Soslovia, like kolkhozniki, kolkhozniks, workers, and служащие, right? And part of the служащие of the servicemen could have been intelligentsia and others, and one could say that kolkhoznik was the lowest, right, of these estates, also ideologically, and even now in our language, when we want to degrade somebody's style or somebody as a person, we say, oh, he's dressed like kolkhoznik, или we say, oh, по-колхозному, что здесь все так по-колхозному, why there is. So there is sort of their low position of kolkhozniks in the Soviet sort of hierarchy of people is still reflected in the language. But that's not, of course, if somebody is seen as, you know, as low in rank or low in culture and so on, it doesn't mean that this is indeed so, right? And kolkhozniks might have lived a good life in the late Soviet period. And I think Caroline Humphrey's book partly attests to it, that the life was not that it was like all easy and so on, but it was not like all horrible. And she is going against this dominant, I guess, view of the Soviet life. And she's writing in the end of the Cold War, right? The first edition of this book was published in 1983, where, you know, like it's a height of the Cold War and people have a very, you know, like grim attitudes of what's happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And she's saying, like, oftentimes people think of totalitarian or states or the Soviet state as they consider it also totalitarian, even in its late Soviet iteration, that people live double lives, right? So one official life and one like where ideological statements are pronounced and so on. And then like the personal real life where everything is kind of upside down, not like as it's stated officially or so on. And she shows that this is not so, that ideology did penetrate, like kolkhoz, the Soviet ideology did penetrate the lives of the people on very private, very intimate levels. And I think this is one of the main arguments in her book. So let's talk a bit about her methodology and where this methodology is originated, and about her access, right? One of the, I think, Adele, you in your review noted, right, that she had this access because which she, you know, negotiated very carefully, saying that she is going to study Buryat kinship, and it's something that's sounds very, you know, ethnographical, even in the Soviet like ethnography, you know, like the Soviet ethnography is a little bit different from American anthropology or British anthropology as we understand it, in the sense that Soviet ethnography disciplinarily was a part of history, right? And ethnographers usually they did not study so-called modern phenomena. They were supposed to study like the remnants of the past, right? Like the backward people, backward societies. And like, for instance, ethnographers would go to auls or to villages and collect folklore and something that's sort of пережитки прошлого, the remnants of the past that still continue to live in the present. Yeah, so that's why sort of the historical, like they are a part of the history. So the phenomena that's not modern, but rather traditional and so on. But then she visits two, she had like two visits in 67, I think, right? In May and June, she visits Karl Marx Sovkhoz in Selenga, kolkhoz, sorry, in Selenga, with a person from the Academy of Sciences. And yeah, she does study Buryat kinship, but she also decided to study the kolkhoz as a, you know, small-scale society. And this is a very kind of British anthropological way of studying, you know, how anthropologists came to study other exotic societies. They would go and they would study the structure, and they would look at the sort of institutions in these societies, like family, I don't know, leadership, education, like military and so on, and they would look at the functions, right? So it was called structural functionalism. So and it was possible because most of the societies that, let's say, some British anthropologist goes to study some like a real British anthropologist, let's say. Radcliffe Brown, or she cites Max Gluckman, who studied African property rights, and I'm blinking on the name of the anthropologist who studied Muir and Azande. Okay, so they would go to some small-scale society, like a tribe, and they would sort of bring out the structure, like and the different kinds of the structure. It could be, and they would like make all these, very detailed diagram, right? Like where the pastures are, like how the pastures, how people move around the pastures, diagrams of the, like calendar year, diagrams of the structural time, diagrams of the genealogical, of the structure of who is like on top of who, like the leadership and so on. And she does the same here. And she says that she didn't even have, like she had recorders, but her batteries died or something. She did not have enough batteries. So she produces all of these very meticulous genealogies, also like the structures. And she looks at the institutions, like what does the structure of the kolkhoz, the structure of the sельсовет, rural Soviet, and the structure of the like party organization in kolkhoz, and who like and she looks at the functions, like for instance, sельсовет, what does it, what is its function, yeah, what does it supposed to do? And she says like sельсовет is supposed to record, like it's a record keeping organ, but it's also like distributing social welfare, it's also distributing private land, so it's kind of also in its own way looking at the functions also. So it's more sort of distributive organ, right? And the kolkhoz is more like the main production organ, right, of this place, and the party. And then she looks at the like the division in the kolkhoz into brigades, and the people, the specialists, like who does what, zootechnic, agronomist, like economist, what they're doing, and who is like what's their function and what they're really doing. And like she looks at the mobility, right? Who is more mobile within, like, and she found, like, for instance, that party leadership is more mobile than like kolkhoz chairman. Kolkhoz chairman position cannot be easily sort of exchange, right? Like one kolkhoz chairman cannot like easily go to another kolkhoz and become a kolkhoz chairman there, but the party secretary can easily go and become a like party secretary at a different place or as a specialist. So this is kind of so she walks in the, I guess, tradition of this British anthropological structural functionalism, well knowing also its limitations and noting the differences. Like one of the things that structural functionalism is criticized for, that it's like focus on the structure and how, and the idea behind it is that the structure is sort of almost organic, like that it fulfills the purpose, and it's you should not sort of mess with the structure because it's important for the overall, like the comparison is often with the organic body, right? Organic body has heart, like the liver, brain, limbs, and so on. And what's everybody, like what's all of this, like what's the function of the brain, what's the function of the liver, what's the function of the limbs, like hands and feet, and so on. And it's almost sort of that every organ has its own function, and it's sort of you cannot do without it, right? It's very balanced structure. And this kind of approach, it doesn't account well for the change in society, right? The structural change. So how does a brain become the limbs, right? Or kind of revolutionary changes or something that can happen. So it's difficult to account then with the structural approach, and she is very cognizant of that criticism, and she pays very strong, pays very detailed attention to the change, right? She says, oh, and now like 6 years later, I come and I notice these changes, and this has happened, and this has been built, and this is no longer the case. But also the historic change, like she looks at how like Buryat culture changed from the colonial period to the from the colonial period through the late Soviet period, and how it was, how the kinship structure was, and how it is at her time when she studied. So that's very important here. So even though her main approach is this traditional structural functionalism, and she is very good at it, she's very good at producing these diagrams and tables, and some of them she she asks people and people give her answers, right? But some of this she also, because she is dealing with the society that's also producing some paperwork about itself, right? And she takes some of these tables, she takes some of these Sельсовет, rural Soviets records, right, of the marriages and who married who, how many marriages there were, and between who, and from that she can also make like some arguments about, let's say, intermarriage, about sort of the reproduction practices, right? How important it is to reproduce, what's the sort of reproductive disposition of the Buryat people as opposed to maybe other people. And for contraception is available and abortion is available to these people, they refrain from it willingly, right? And they, even if it's for instance, pregnancy out of the wedlock, they still would rather give birth than terminate pregnancy in some. So like these people are not predisposed to contraception and abortion because it's something that, because there is a very high value of reproduction and of children and so on in this society, which maybe has to do with the previous histories of struggling with maintaining the population numbers and such. And so that's what I wanted to tell about her approach, that even though like her main approach, structural functionalism, she is very cognizant of the sort of some problems with it, and that's her main, that it does not, it's not very well tuned to account for dynamics and change in the society, and she pays particular attention to what happened, how it was previously, and how it's changing. And I think this book, because it ends with the last chapter, like what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, with another dramatic change in people's lives. So there is enough drama and development in this book. We see that these societies are not static, that they are changing, and these kolkhozes. Another theoretical, rather theoretical point that I wanted to make is about the division of labor. And she talks about, she has a special chapter, which I think my favorite chapter in this book is her chapter on the division of labor in kolkhozes, and in kolkhozes that she studied, and the description, very detailed description of everybody's work. I was very I remember I was very quite impressed by all this description. And of course, the most heartbreaking description was the description of milkmaid's life. Maybe we'll read it if we have time that accept that the milkmaids were really like the most working the most and paid the least, and sort of it's a very almost the bottom of the hierarchy, unfortunately, and how and what the division of labor had to do with this, and how the division of labor was not fair, even though it was like praised by the Soviet ideology as very progressive, right, and leading to the increase of production. And the little theoretical intervention that I wanted to make is about the division of labor idea itself, and it's an sort of iteration in the Marxist ideology and so on. So I know those of you who took economics classes must have read The Wealth of Nations, right? Or by Adam Smith. And the Wealth of Nations starts with an example of the pin factory, right? And the main argument of Adam Smith and the pin factory, previously pin factory were pins, you know, pins in Russian, bulavka, yeah? Pins were produced by craftsmen, yeah, ремесленники. So one craftsman, he produces like, let's say per day, he produced like 10 or 15 pins from the beginning to the end, right? But then with the advent of industrialization, what happens is a pin factory is created instead of the craftsman, instead of the shop. Now we have the pin factory. And the production of pin is sort of cut into several operations, right? And he describes how somebody sharpens the wire, somebody straightens the wire, somebody sharpens the wire, somebody, like every operation is done by a separate person. And then in the end, somebody puts even the ready pin into an envelope, right? If previously, so this one small like pin was produced, could have been produced by one person, now it's divided into this assembly line production, right? And for Adam Smith, it is seen like a increase of productivity, and that's what leads to the wealth of nations. So division of labor, so dividing the production of this pin into several, like 10 or even more operations, makes this sort of pin factory produce 10 times as much or even more than like craftsmen could have produced. And this leads to the wealth. Like if previously, for instance, craftsmen through manual labor could produce only limited number of goods, now through this division of labor at the factories, and division of labor sort of in this way it's almost synonymous with industrialization, right? So that this division of one sort of set of production into several operations, it's sort of assembly line work, right? Конвейеризация производства, it increases productivity. So more and more pins can be produced, or more and more goods, like other goods like textile, from wool, from, let's say, coats and so on, could have been produced in the factories and like by one sort of seamstress, right, who could do this. And so this division of labor, it leads to the wealth of nations. For instance, then England and Scotland, where this division of labor is in place, and are the richest nations. And then he contrasts them, let's say, with Poland, right, where the country is not industrialized, it depends on agriculture. And the problem with agriculture is that it itself well to the division of labor. And that's what Caroline Humphrey describes, right? So because agriculture is sort of, the nature has already, let's say, divided the regions, and the nature has already created certain specializations, right? So for instance, that, you know, in the Kazakh steppes, like horse herding is a specialization, right, by climatic conditions. And let's say in some other areas where soil is richer, like Chernozemie and so on, it's good for agriculture, right? And in some areas there is a rainfall agriculture. In our areas where it's very risky, where there is no irrigation, for instance, in many areas where in Kazakhstan and where we grow, as well as in Buryatia, where we grow grain. So our grain harvest is really sort of, that's why it's called the zone of risky agriculture, right? Zona рискованного земледелия, yeah, because we depend on rainfall. And in such summers as, for instance, this summer where we had drought, like there is of course not much produce on this, because this agriculture depends on the rainfall and grain production. So in agriculture, there is also, first of all, the one person. It's difficult to make one person specialize in one thing because it's seasonal. Like, so one season you do one thing, like the season changes and you do a different thing, because, you know, like you can harvest only like during certain season, you cannot harvest all year round. So the skills that you use for harvesting could not be used like all the time, right? Unlike in the pin factory, which can work all year round, and you can straighten your wire all year round and sharpen your wire all year round. And also it's difficult to subdivide the labor because, for instance, it's milk production, right? It's which you have this cow, right? And the division of labor is that, and in this kolkhoz also, is that somebody feeds the cow, right? And then somebody else milks the cow, right? But of course, the production is dependent upon not only milkmaid who milks, but also how this cow has been fed, right, before it was milk. So then, like, really the production of milk is not milkmaids only. It does not depend only on milkmaid, right? And so it's difficult to divide like animals into this. That you know, somebody feeds the cow, somebody milks the cow, somebody does it. Also, like, there could be some divisions, like for instance for Smith, like if you want to подковать лошадь, like to, what would be in English for подковать, like to shoe the horse, right? Like for instance, it's a specialization of the Smith, right? Кузнецкая специализация. But like in other ways, like usually people who feed the cow, they can also milk the cow, right? And it's even better because then these people would know, and they have this sort of holistic knowledge of how to do things around cows or around sheep or around horses or with any type of agricultural work. And even with pin factory, one could argue that, you know, it's better from the person's perspective. Like if I am like a worker, it would be better for me to know all of this, right? The pin production from all of its, if I know all the operations of the pin production, right? Then I don't depend on this factor. I can go out and produce pins on my own, and I don't have to be what Marx would call an appendage for the machine. But the narrow specialization, it's sort of, as Marx would say, it debilitates the worker, right? Because he becomes this very narrow, he's responsible for this very narrow operation, and he does not develop in terms of, and its operation itself, it's very dull, oftentimes, and it's does not have any sort of a person does not get any moral satisfaction out of it, right? Because the moral satisfaction is when you of labor, when you see the products of your labor, when the labor brings you fruits and so on. But in this kind of labor, it's not very feasible, right? And of course, the situation that how did these people get into this pin factory and agreed to do this kind of very dull and very narrow specialized operations. So that's the sort of the background of the division of labor. And in the Marxist sort of iteration of the division of labor, and then creation of the kolkhozes as well, there was this, even though of course they were against the exploitation of workers' labor, exploitations of the agriculturalist labor, the peasants' labor, and so on. But in the idea, the modernization of the agricultural work sort of lay in this sphere of the division of labor and mechanization. So you have to mechanize, you have to sort of do everything according to like sort of with a scientific method, right? So you have to do the counting, and you have to even mechanize the sort of the milking and so on. The idea that it would bring more produce. But the problem was that oftentimes this kind of their growth depended, for instance, their growth in sheep, the idea was dependent on very traditional kind of production, right? That herdsmen who use their sort of traditional knowledge, even though there was a transformation with this traditional knowledge, because people did not use it as a knowledge, right? While it is a knowledge of the landscape, it is a knowledge that comes from experience of dealing with this, but it was transformed into wisdom, right? It's not a proper knowledge, it's kind of folks' wisdom of how to raise sheep, how to make it fatter, how to fatten livestock, and so on. So that's one of the transformations and one of the kind of theoretical insights into the division of labor and the ideology of the division of labor, which was also permeating Soviet production and also agricultural production is important. So maybe now I'll also stop recording. Although Ajar asked me to, okay, let me stop recording here, and then the discussion I'll record separately. And how do I stop recording? Okay, meeting host. Now I have to change you into.
Do you want me to stop recording? I think I see the button.
Yeah, could you stop and then start again? Mm-hmm.